All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Iran 1400 Spotlighting an Author event. Today, we will be discussing Dr. Robert Steele's book, The Shah's Imperial Celebrations of 1971, Nationalism, Culture, and Politics in Late Pahlavi Iran. Thank you all for joining us. As many of you know, the goal of the Iran 1400 project is to encourage productive conversations about Iran by looking at the evolution of ideas and institutions within the country during the last century. We are certain that today's discussion will be a valuable resource in that mission. But before we introduce our guest, our communications manager, Tabi Anvari, will share remarks on behalf of Iran 1400's advisory board.
Dr. Steele, on behalf of the advisory board and the team at the Iran 1400 project, we thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to be with us today. The Iran 1400 project's mission is to foster a greater understanding of Iran's history during the past century in order to promote an informed conversation about Iran's future. We are honored to have you with us today to share your research and insight on the Iranian experience.
Thank you, Tabi. And now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce today's distinguished guest. Dr. Robert Steele is a historian of modern Iran whose work focuses on cultural policy and Iran's global interactions during the late Pahlavi period. He completed his PhD at the University of Exeter's Institute of Arab and Islamic Studies in 2018, and from 2019 until 2021, he was the inaugural Jahangir and Eleanor Amuzegar postdoctoral fellow in modern Iranian history in the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Cultures at the University of California, Los Angeles. His current research project explores Iran's political and cultural connections with sub-Saharan Africa in the 1960s and 70s, with a particular focus on how the two major global events of the period, the Cold War and decolonization, and Iran's experience of both, shaped those interactions. Before we begin the event, I will just explain the format for the audience. So we will listen to Dr. Steele discuss his book for around 30 minutes. And after that, we will be having a 30-minute Q&A. Y'all can submit your questions to either the Q&A section in the Zoom event, or you can email those questions to media@iran1400.org. And now, before we begin, we have a quick teaser. Dr. Steele, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you to Sydney for this introduction and to Iran 1400 for the invitation. It's a real pleasure to be here and to have the opportunity to discuss my research. If I can... Okay, the celebrations to commemorate the 2500th anniversary of the founding of the Persian Empire by Cyrus the Great were held nearly 51 years ago. This event was one of the iconic moments in the late Pahlavi era, and in many scholarly and popular accounts of that period, it's described as having directly contributed to the revolution of 1979. In this popular narrative, hundreds of millions of dollars were spent to dine the world's elite in an ostentatious display of wealth at Persepolis, while ordinary Iranians were completely absent, allowed only to watch events unfold on their television sets, listen on the radio, or read about it in newspapers. In the following years, as the Shah became ever more bewitched by illusions of imperial grandeur, he became more detached from his people and even sought to replace Islam as a source of reverence with the crown. However, in spite of the perceived importance of the event in the history of modern Iran, it's not until recently been the subject of any serious scholarly study. Many reports in foreign newspapers at the time focused on the idea of the event as a party held as an exercise in vanity by a modern-day Oriental despot. A report from the Washington Daily News stated that the celebrations were little more than a vain, pompous, vulgar show of wealth, and in mockery of the debauchery of the spectacle, wrote, "To be fair, Empress Farah hasn't said of starving Iranian peasants, let them eat caviar, but she is looking a bit peaked and round-shouldered from carting around all those diamonds, and the tone of the party is very Marie Antoinette." Newsweek wrote that the event was a mixture of pomp and pomposity, of regal splendor and petty carping. Already at the time, some observers criticized the attitude of the attending press. The Dutch ambassador described the journalists as, quote, waiting for blood, for an attack or an accident. In anything else, they are not interested. The Pahlavi regime played into the hands of its domestic and foreign critics, as it presented luxury expenditure as indicative of the success of the Shah's resurgent Iran, and ensured that these aspects of the event reached a large audience. One of the main daily newspapers, for example, called the gala dinner at Persepolis Porshakutarin Mehmani Tarikh, the most magnificent party in history. And other newspapers were quick to report on the expensive contracts signed with foreign companies. Because of its extravagance and irreligion, from exile in Najaf, the dissident cleric Ruhollah Khomeini called the event Bazmi Ahriman, the Devil's Feast. The celebrations have thus come to be remembered as a costly mistake, the grandiosity of which, as Marvin Zonis noted, would characterize the remainder of the Shah's rule. He continues, for the Shah himself, it would bring a complete divorce from reality. He became more and more obsessed with his own kingship and the importance of his direct succession from Cyrus. In 2016, a documentary was broadcast on the subject of the celebrations, which features great footage of the event and interviews with figures who participated. However, as the title, Decadence and Downfall, suggests, the documentary also repeats this same narrative, linking the 1971 celebrations to the fall of the Shah. It even opens with the caption, in 1971, the Shah of Iran threw a party at Persepolis, the ancient capital of the Persian Empire. It paved the way for the downfall of the Shah and ushered in an era of Islamic revolutions. A British tabloid reviewed the program with the headline, Princess Anne and the £1 billion party that lit the fuse of Islamic terror 45 years ago, and argued that the great irony is that the Shah's feast was supposed to reinforce the throne it ultimately toppled, which really goes to show how these popular representations of the celebrations have come to shape the public's imagination. What I've tried to do in my book is to provide a more nuanced assessment of the celebrations and their role in Iran's history. I challenge the prevailing narrative of the celebrations to argue that although many mistakes were made, and in terms of public relations, they could be considered a disaster, they did broadly achieve their primary objective, set out when they were conceived in the late 1950s and as they developed into the 1960s. This objective was, in the words of one of the organizers, Abdolreza Ansari, to initiate the reawakening of the history, civilization, and culture of Iran and creating awareness among the peoples of the world. The attendance of foreign VIPs, the construction of their accommodation at Persepolis, and the sumptuous banquet provided in their honor are those aspects of the celebrations most vividly remembered. But I aim to look beyond these aspects to show how the celebrations were part of and fully consistent with the regime's ambitious cultural policy programs of the 1960s and 70s. During this period, cultural policy was broadly divided between the Ministry of Culture and Art, under the direction of Mehrdad Khonsari, and the Imperial Court, under Shoja-ad-Din Shafar. While the Ministry of Culture and Art was concerned with film, art, music, and literature, the Imperial Court's cultural section was in charge of education and scholarship. The imperial celebrations, I argue in the book, were conceived at the court, and throughout their planning and implementation, remained heavily influenced by scholars linked to the court and organizations headed by Shah. My book also identifies and discusses some of the problems in the historiography of late Pahlavi Iran. This includes the misuse and neglect of key sources among even serious historians, and the inherent problems in the sensationalization of events associated with the Pahlavi monarchy. Indeed, in certain respects, our understanding of events that took place in the late Pahlavi period are still dominated by narratives established at that time. And the celebrations are perhaps the most striking example of this. So I'll begin this talk with Shojaddin Shah. Shojaddin Shah was one of the most important figures in devising and carrying out cultural policy in the late Pahlavi period. He was described by the renowned American scholar Richard Fry, who worked alongside him in the 1960s and 70s, as being a kind of cultural Shah under the Shah, who built up a kind of reputation in trying to, and I'm sure he convinced the Shah that it was a good thing to do, to make Iran internationally known in the academic world, in the world of writers, in the intellectual world. Shah was an intellectual himself, and he considered scholarship important to both the modernization of Iran and also improving the perception of Iran around the world. He remained in his role for over 20 years because, as he wrote, I had the 100% backing of the Shah. His confidence in me on occasion hindered attempts by some people to disengage me from my position. He was therefore in a privileged position to be able to influence the Shah and steer cultural policy. He became the chief ideologue at the court, ghostwriting two of the Shah's books, The White Revolution and Towards the Great Civilization, and serving as his primary speechwriter. Through his cultural policy, Shah had two main goals. First, to contribute to the ideologization of the monarchy in Iran, and second, in line with the state's modernization efforts, to support scholarship that was scientifically objective, and in doing so, ensure that the Shah would not be seen by the world as some Oriental despot, but an enlightened king, a patron of scientific inquiry, and a guardian of Iranian culture. At the Imperial court, Shah instigated several important cultural organizations to contribute to this, including the Imperial Cultural Council, the Pahlavi Library, the Committee for Compiling the History of Iran, the Committee for the International Fight Against Illiteracy, and the Encyclopedia Jahani-Iran Shalasi. And it was he who first proposed the imperial celebrations in 1958. Shah claimed that the idea for the imperial celebrations was inspired by a similar commemoration of Cyrus that was planned to take place in Israel in 1961 to mark 2,500 years since Cyrus's liberation of the Jews from captivity in Babylon. When an Israeli representative explained to him that Cyrus appears in the Torah as the Lord Messiah, he said, "Until this time, I did not know of this matter in the Torah. Cyrus freed everyone. Everyone was free to practice their own religion. Everyone had freedom of thought in life. And it came to my mind, why do we not commemorate Cyrus ourselves today?" Shah also had a close affiliation with UNESCO and considered it important for Iran's emerging position in the world and the United Nations community that it nurtured these ties. Since 1954, UNESCO had been encouraging member states to hold commemorations of events or people of significance and published a list of proposals annually. UNESCO responded positively to the initial idea for the celebrations, which proposed to commemorate the start of the expansion of a culture whose arts, science, and literature have been central forces in the artistic and intellectual development of both Orient and Occident. At the General Conference of 1960, UNESCO urged the world to join in the commemoration of Cyrus. Cultural dissemination through commemorative activity was within the framework of what UNESCO was attempting to achieve at this time, and the occasion proposed by Shah would seek to contribute to this effort. The proposal was immediately accepted by both Court Minister Allah and the Shah, and in December 1958, a group of 9 scholars and political figures was set up to investigate the matter, 7 of whom, the first 7 on the list on the screen, later served on the Imperial Cultural Council, and 5 of whom, the first 5, had been involved in the Ferdowsi celebration 23 years earlier, which really indicates the lasting influence of these people on cultural politics at the imperial court. It was in these early stages that plans were made to organize a military parade at Persepolis, a commemoration at the tomb of Cyrus the Great, and a scholarly conference, events which remained key aspects of the celebrations as they developed. This small working group expanded into a 33-man committee, which included the heads of every government ministry, heads of relevant organizations, and several cultural and military figures. So the celebrations were initially planned to take place in 1961, but then they were repeatedly delayed throughout the 1960s, from 1961 to 1962 to 1965, and then 1967, before the final date of 1971 was set. The main reason for the delays was that Iran lacked the means at the time to implement the celebrations on the scale the organizers had envisaged. Indeed, when announcing one such delay, Javad Bushiri wrote of the importance of them being implemented in a well-ordered fashion, worthy of the ancient and glorious Persian Empire. The result of these delays, however, was that the celebrations took place 10 years late, and so 1971, unlike 1961, was rather an arbitrary date on which to hold a 2,500-year anniversary. So these celebrations began on the 12th of October, 1971, with the glorification of Cyrus ceremony. In the weeks prior to the event, a number of column drums, remains of a 13th century mosque around the tomb, had been removed to reveal the monument in its ancient grandeur. In other words, not contaminated by Islamic features. Speaking to the spirit of the ancient king, the Shah vowed to preserve forever the traditions of humanism and goodwill with which you founded the Persian Empire, thus linking Cyrus to Western intellectual tradition. And this was not a new idea, as since the 19th century, scholars have spoken of the exceptionalism of Cyrus. In the 1920s, Hassan Pirniar, for example, referred to the moral revolution that occurred under the rule of Cyrus the Great. And this was a theme which continued into the 1960s and 70s. So in the Shah's Mission for My Country, published in 1961, the Shah wrote, "While Iran at the time knew nothing of democratic political institutions, Cyrus nevertheless demonstrated some of the qualities which provide the strength of the great modern democracies." He also wrote that the empire founded by Cyrus the Great was not based on territorial acquisition alone, but also on international tolerance and understanding. The rights of all the subject nations were upheld and their laws and customs respected. Indeed, I see in our first empire something of the United Nations of nearly 2,500 years later. In a publication at the time of the celebrations, Shah wrote, "Such a vast empire was founded by Cyrus the Great on the principles of liberty and tolerance, freedom of individuals and nations to practice any religion, freedom of expression, and freedom of national habits and customs. This is the greatest gift that Iran has given to human society." Having established Cyrus as one of the great heroes of Iranian history, a modernizer in his own time and intellectually progressive, the regime presented the Shah as his spiritual successor. Stone tablets bearing text of the Shah's White Revolution and the Cyrus Cylinder were erected in cities across Iran, linking the policies of the Shah to his ancient forebear. This was evident in newspapers too, when the Shah was often pictured alongside Cyrus, contributing to the ideologization of the monarchy as a historic institution, placing the Pahlavis firmly within this ancient tradition, and presenting the Shah as Cyrus's ultimate successor and his equal in terms of his importance in Iranian history. This message was not lost on the foreign attendees. The eminent historian of Safavid Iran, Roger Savory, who was one of the scholars present at the glorification ceremony at Pasargad, wrote, for example, "We are celebrating this anniversary because the present Shahanshah of Iran sees himself as being, in a very real sense, the heir of Cyrus the Great and the inheritor of his empire. No one, I think, who was present at the dignified and moving ceremony at the tomb of Cyrus could doubt this for one moment." On the following day, 13th of October, the Second International Congress of Iranology began. The hosting of a major international scholarly conference in Iran in conjunction with the celebrations had been designated a priority by the organizers as early as 1959, when Hossein Allah informed foreign diplomats that, quote, according to present plans, the central point of the celebrations would now be an international archaeological congress in Iran. This congress was planned to be the largest Iranian studies conference ever held, and the organizers sought out the most established names in their field to take part. According to the official program, 275 scholars from 38 countries attended, not including Israelis, who were officially excluded, but who did in fact attend. Despite the political nature of the event, very few academics turned down their invitations, and it appears as though there was a general eagerness to take part. It was common knowledge at the time, for example, that the loan of the Cyrus cylinder to Iran during the celebrations was facilitated by the British Museum curator Richard Barnett in return for an invitation. And several scholars, including Lawrence Elwood Sutton, Bernard Lewis, and Donald Wilbur, wrote favorable accounts of the event afterwards. The title of the Congress was The Continuity of Iranian Civilization and Culture, and in the following days, 25 papers were delivered on a wide range of subjects, although papers focusing on the Achaemenid period received special attention. Addressing the Congress with a message from the Shah, Asadullah Alam said, "The anniversary celebration is above all the celebration of Iranian history, civilization, and culture. Therefore, it is only natural that the eminent scholars who have devoted their lives to research on the various aspects of our culture and history take a special place in this celebration and in the hearts of the Iranian people." A special book series was established by the Pahlavi Library and Brill in order to publish the proceedings of the Congress, called Acta Iranica, which continued to publish long after the revolution. On the evening of 14th of October, a gala dinner took place for the 62 heads of state or their representatives who'd been invited. During the banquet, the Shah gave a speech, written incidentally, as all the speeches for the celebrations were, by Shah. Against the backdrop of Persepolis, the ceremonial capital of an empire which the Shah's regime had presented as based on values of tolerance and human rights, the message presented the Shah as a progressive, willing to take the lead in solving the problems of the world. Moreover, the references to the enjoyments of the full amenities of science, of honoring Iranian culture and heritage, and of the host being history rather than himself, enforced the representation of the Shah's Iran as modern, and the Shah himself, by valuing empiricism and rational thought, as encapsulating some of the ideals of European Enlightenment tradition. On the next day, 15th of October, a military parade took place. Over the course of 2 hours, soldiers representing the armies of the many ruling dynasties of Iran, dressed in painstakingly recreated costumes, paraded in front of the assembled guests by the ancient ruins. In a speech introducing the parade, the Shah announced that his soldiers, like the soldiers of Achaemenid times, revere as the sacred goal the combination of national sovereignty and moral standards of 25 centuries ago. Just as in ancient times, soldiers were inspired to act according to the moral conviction of their ruler, who ruled fairly and justly. So too did the modern Iranian armed forces. The preparation for the parade took 13 years, during which scholars researched historical military dress to ensure the greatest possible accuracy. This extensive background research was presented in several works, published in conjunction with the event, and these works helped to legitimize the parade as an authentic representation of Iran's continuity over 2,500 years. They also underlined the fact that the event was more than mere pageantry. It was intended to have lasting cultural as well as immediate symbolic value. And actually today, 25 mannequins dressed in costumes from the parade, complete with standards and artificial beards, are on display in a prominent position in the military museum at Sadabad Palace. So although the Islamic Republic calls these celebrations the Devil's Feast, it seems that there's maybe some recognition, even from them, of the value of these costumes. Other countries also contributed to the celebrations with their own programs of events. Culture can play an important soft power role in international relations, and the organizers of the celebrations encouraged states around the world to express their friendship with Iran through cultural activity. As a result, concurrently with the celebrations, hundreds of exhibitions, congresses, seminars, and other events were held around the world, dedicated to aspects of Iranian civilization. To maximize the soft power exerted through these events, many were designed to feed into the principal theme of the celebrations, which stressed over 2,500 years of Iranian cultural integrity in the face of multiple foreign incursions. From the early 1960s, Shojadin Shafar had been working with cultural institutes worldwide to promote the celebrations and to encourage them to take part. As a result, over 40 international Cyrus the Great committees, as they were called, were set up by governments around the world, consisting of a mix of political and cultural figures. Stating the purpose of the French Committee, which was the first to be established in 1961 and which served as a blueprint for other such committees, French Minister of Cultural Affairs André Malraux wrote, "The French Committee, basing its activities on the friendship which has united our two countries for so long, undertakes to make even better known the civilizing history of Iran, as well as the achievements of modern Iran." Some historians and journalists have pointed out that the fact that many important political figures, in particular Queen Elizabeth, President Nixon, and President Pompidou, declined to attend the celebrations of Persepolis, serves as evidence that the celebrations were not taken particularly seriously by Western governments. In contrast, the level of attention the event received outside of Iran, and indeed the desire by governments to ensure that their government made a marked contribution, indicates the exact opposite. For example, opening an exhibition titled 2,500 Years of the Iranian Empire at the Museum for Völkerkunde in Vienna, President Franz Jonas stressed the unique bond of friendship that existed between Iran and Austria. He said, "Austria and Iran have never been enemies. The Austrians may be proud of the fact that the treasures of ancient Iran, which our country looks after, never came into Austrian possession as trophies of armed conflicts, but instead were often gifts for highly placed guests, which were gladly given and gladly received. Despite the great geographical distance, Iran and Austria have always been connected by a bond of friendship." In the Netherlands, a ceremony was held at the Hall of Knights in The Hague on the 14th of October to coincide with the main festivities in Iran. That the ceremony was held in such a location where the monarch opens parliament every year and official delegations are received indicates its political significance. Professor Ari Kampmann delivered a lecture on Cyrus the Great to the 600 guests, which included Queen Juliana, Princess Beatrix, and Prince Claus, along with the Iranian ambassador and the ambassadors to the Netherlands of 40 other countries. The Dutch were eager to stress that the type of event that took place in the Hall of Knights formed a unique contribution to the commemoration outside of Iran. And there are so many examples of these types of events, but it's clear that foreign governments saw something to gain by making a contribution to the celebrations. The more enthusiastic and imaginative, the better. Earlier, I quoted Abdul Reza Ansari, who said that the primary goal of the celebrations was to initiate the reawakening of the history, civilization, and culture of Iran and creating awareness among the peoples of the world. One of the ways in which we may measure the success of the creation of this awareness among peoples of the world is through tourism figures. In the 5 years following the celebrations, the number of tourists visiting Iran more than doubled, and foreign currency earnings from tourism nearly quadrupled. The British ambassador in Tehran at the time of the celebrations, Peter Ransbottom, who later went on to serve as ambassador in Washington, said, "When I was in the United States afterwards, people knew about it. Oh, gee, were you at Persepolis? They actually knew where Persia was. They never knew before. It was a successful way of putting Persia on the international map." In an interview published after his death in 2010, Shojadin Shafar said that the celebrations were a great source of pride for me and even the greatest honor of my life. So one can argue with some justification that the underlying narrative ultimately contributed to the revolution, that the security clampdown helped to present the Shah as a cruel despot, or that the vast expenditure, whether real or rumored, helped to characterize the regime as corrupt and wasteful. But beyond the pomp and splendor of the tent city, the celebrations provided the backdrop and the funding for many valuable cultural and academic endeavors, some of which served to promote the Pahlavi state ideology, which argued that the monarchy was central to the past and future successes of Iran, but many also sought to stimulate genuine scholarly inquiry. So what I proposed here and in my book is one narrative of the 1971 imperial celebrations, and I fully accept that there are other interpretations and viewpoints that should not be ignored. But I think we learn more from the celebrations and from other events in the Pahlavi period if we look beyond the popular narrative of the doomed Shah or the megalomaniac dictator. And I'd like to end this talk by noting two problems in the historiography of late Pahlavi Iran that I observed in the research for this book. Firstly, sources. So although many researchers working on the late Pahlavi period do not have access to archives in Iran, there are several organizations in Iran that do publish archival material. And of course, most of this is incomplete, and documents are generally selected to fit into the historical narrative of the compiler, as happens in other countries, by the way. So we must be aware of the pitfalls associated with such collections. But the 4-volume collection published by the Islamic Republic, the Ministry of Information, on the celebrations, it's called Bazmiat Iman, is a very rich source that contains extremely valuable information, including minutes of meetings between the organizing committees, communications between committees and ministries, and SAVAK reports on security. But despite the fact that this 4-volume set is quite easy to get hold of, very few historians actually reference it. Indeed, in the most recent accounts I've read of the celebrations, the authors mainly use Western newspapers. And I spoke earlier in this talk about the tendency of newspapers at the time of the celebrations to sensationalize. So by relying on such sources, these scholars merely repeat accounts from the time, many of which had no basis in reality. Another issue is that many of the sources historians use can be problematic. One example is the abridged English translation of the diaries of the Shah's court minister, Asadullah Alam, which is replete with inaccurate translations, which authors often quote from without checking the original Persian for accuracy. For example, several authors have cited a story in which Alam suggests to Empress Farah that they attend a screening at the official film of the celebrations in October 1972, 1 year after the festivities. In the abridged English version, Farah responds to Alam's suggestion by saying, "For goodness sake, leave me alone. I want our names to be utterly disassociated from those ghastly celebrations." The original Persian, however, simply reads, "Velam kon digar nemikhaham dar in kar jashnha ismi az ma borde shavad." Leave me alone. I do not want our names to be associated with the work on these celebrations anymore. The difference is slight, but actually quite powerful. But many scholars have used this as evidence that the empress was against the celebrations and focused particularly on the line "ghastly celebrations," which she didn't actually say. And here are 3 examples of how this particular passage has been taken out of context. So I think this really emphasizes the need, particularly when studying the celebrations, but also the Pahlavi period more generally, for a careful and measured analysis of primary source material. The second point is the acceptance of the sensationalist narrative without question. Of course, this is linked also to the use of source material, but when it comes to the Pahlavi period in general, we seem to accept what's been told us without checking the provenance of the story. For example, this story that Empress Farah used to bathe in milk. And I uncovered many of these types of stories during my research, which are often repeated, but again, which have no basis in fact. For example, in the BBC documentary Decadence and Downfall, the claim was repeated that 50,000 European songbirds were imported to Persepolis to beautify the site, most of which died within days as they were unaccustomed to the desert climate. While several newspaper journalists and authors have accepted this claim at face value and repeated it verbatim, upon closer inspection, one realizes how illogical it is. There are many birds indigenous to the region that the organizers could have used to beautify the site, so why import from Europe? How would the organizers even source and import 50,000 birds? Moreover, historical climate data for Persepolis shows that in October, temperatures tend to vary from a minimum of 10 degrees Celsius at night to 20 degrees Celsius during the day, not extreme temperatures by Iranian or even European standards. Aside from these logical problems, there's simply no documentation to verify the claim. Indeed, I contacted the chief ornithologist at the Department of Game and Fish at the time, and he'd never heard of the story. It appears to have simply been made up and is now part of the mythology of the celebrations. The second example is a little more complicated as it relates to the cost of the celebrations, which fluctuates wildly depending on which source one uses. I don't think I've ever seen a calculation for the cost of the celebration that doesn't come from a newspaper article published at the time of the event. And all of these figures were seemingly plucked from thin air. For example, one Dutch newspaper reported it as fantastic but true that the celebrations will cost $1 billion in total. Another Dutch newspaper claimed that they actually cost $4 billion. The overseas-based opposition publication, Iran Free Press, wrote, "Men of conscience the world over will either laugh or cry at the presumptuousness of an illiterate despot who will wantonly squander $600 million to bedazzle a handful of ineffective or second-rate plenipotentiaries, while his own people wallow and die in their own filth, just beyond the smelling distance of his opulent tables." The high costs stated here really help to draw a distinction between the decadence of the Pahlavi court and the rest of his country. But surprisingly, such figures are not only never challenged by historians, but they're often merely repeated. For example, James Bill states in his The Eagle and the Lion that the celebrations cost $200 million, which he admitted is, quote, a personal estimate based on an examination of various sources. But he doesn't directly reference any of these various sources. Now, there are several problems with providing a figure for the cost of the celebrations, which is why in my book, I refrain from doing so. Firstly, it's difficult to determine which aspects could be considered ephemeral and which were long-lasting. In fact, most of the biggest expenditures, the Shah Tower, the asphalting of roads between Tehran and Shiraz, the refurbishment of airports, the hotels in Tehran, Shiraz, and Persepolis, could all be considered long-term investment. And in fact, a lot of the spending was covered in the plan organization's fourth plan. There's even an argument to be made that the tent city could be considered as part of the regime's long-term tourism strategy, because it was handed over to the tourist organization after the event, and there are documents that show that there were plans to turn the site into tourist accommodation. Second, money came from many different sources, including government ministries and the Imperial court. But a large portion of the costs, perhaps even the vast majority, were covered by private donations. The British ambassador even stated in his report of the event that British banks contributed financially. Third, not only did money come from different sources, but it was also spread out over a period of years. For example, the accounts of the Central Council show that between 1339 and 1349, the purchases of the Central Council amounted to $5.6 million, in 1350, $7.7 million, and in 1351, $4.6 million. Of course, there were additional expenditures on top of this, but these figures clearly show that spending was spread over a period of time. And this seems to contradict the idea that there was a huge strain on the economy in 1971 because the regime had to pay for the celebrations. And fourth, the documentation we do have are quite scattered, and there's very little firm evidence of such huge sums. Indeed, the final accounts of the Central Council, published in the volume Bazmi-Ahriman, show that it spent $24 million, $3 million of which was taken out of its budget to pay for the coronation 4 years earlier. And the idea that there was a bottomless cash fund to pay for the event is also not reflected in the sources. For example, the British Council had planned to send the London Symphony Orchestra to perform in Iran during the celebrations, but these plans were scrapped because the Ministry of Culture stated that it could not afford to pay the customary fee of £6,000. And in Alam's diary, he records that he came to the Shah one day with a design of the dining hall of the tent city, and the Shah balked at the cost and told Alam to renegotiate. So I'm not disputing that 100, 200, or perhaps even $300 million might have been spent on the celebrations, or that there was considerable waste. But I think scholars who study the event should rather question what was money spent on, where did that money come from, and what is the source of that figure. So what I've attempted and hopefully achieved in my book is to provide a dispassionate analysis of the anniversary celebrations, their aims and outcomes. I contextualize these celebrations in late Pahlavi cultural politics, but I hope also to have challenged some of our perceptions
Thank you so much for that, Dr. Steele. That was a fascinating presentation. We appreciate your time. I'm going to remind the audience real quickly of our Q&A session that we have coming up. So for the Q&A session, please do send your, oh, I'm hearing y'all don't see me. 1 second. Let's see. All right, there I am. Sorry about that. So I assume y'all had heard what I was saying. So please send your Q&A questions to the Q&A section, or you can email your questions to media@iran1400.org. But I wanted to remind everyone in the audience real quickly, I've got Dr. Steele's book in front of me. So the thesis of his book is he demonstrated this very well during his PowerPoint. He argued this well. The thesis says the book aims to remove the celebrations from the revolution, putting them in the context of the Shah's rise rather than his fall. It will question what the regime aimed to achieve by holding the event in terms of ideological dissemination, by promoting the historical narrative, as well as in terms of material gains, by encouraging foreign investment and tourism. The success of the celebrations will, in this book, be judged by the extent to which they achieved the objectives set out when they were conceived in 1958. So that is what Dr. Steele's book is and presentation is focusing on. And so for today's event, we will try to focus on questions relevant to that point that he's hoping to prove. But we do welcome conversation about other topics. And if you feel very strongly about discussing other things that can relate to that in some way, please send us an email at the Iran 1400 project. You go to our website, you can see that we have a contact section there, and feel free to let us know what you would like us to talk about. If you have an author in mind who might have made a different point that you'd like to touch on, please recommend them to us. We welcome this lively discussion, but we do want to stay in line with the book for today and not get too off topic. So before we get into our Q&A section, I just have a few announcements. The Iran 1400 project was very happy to have had a successful meeting with our advisory board, Dr. Hoda Mahmoudi and Dr. Aram Hassami on Tuesday. We were also incredibly grateful to have been joined by Dr. Ervan Dabrahamian, Dr. Ali Mirsipasi, and Dr. Mansour Farhang, who were all kind enough to share their ideas and suggestions for the project. We look forward to implementing the recommendations, and we're excited for y'all to see what's next. As I said before, if anyone in the audience has any questions, suggestions, or general feedback for the project, you can send us a message at media@iran1400.org. The goal of the project is to reflect on the past, present, and future of Iran through diving deeper into the ideas and institutions throughout Iran. If you have a topic in line with that, or if you have a person you'd like us to get in contact with, or a contributor in mind, please feel free to email us. The project hopes to provide informed commentary in order to bridge the gap between academia and the general public. So even if you yourself would like to contribute, please send us an email. And we are also excited to have Dr. Steele joining us later in the year as a panelist at our MESA panel. Our panel is titled Iran's Place in the World, Visions and Ambitions in the Last Century. And Dr. Steele's paper is called Iran's Relations with Southern Africa in the 1970s, Oil, Race, and the Cold War. And last but not least, I'm excited to share with y'all that we just published a new podcast with Dr. Eric Loeb called How the Progression of Construction Jihad Parallels the Evolution of the Islamic Republic. You can find this captivating discussion on your favorite podcast app, such as Spotify or Apple Podcasts. You will also receive an email with the links to the article and podcast later today. Now, once again, feel free to throw those questions in the Q&A section or email them to us. While we continue waiting for those questions to trickle in, I have one of my own that I would like to ask Dr. Steele. So how is, in line with the Iran 1400 project, which is to view the evolution of these ideas, institutions, and even as your book talks about our understanding of history. So you touched in your presentation on how the evolution of this, history, and you focused on a lot of Western history and how we how the West and Western scholars saw this history evolving, as in just things that were more clarified and new ideas that came to light. In that, how has this history evolved in the last 40 years in the Islamic Republic? Is this an event studied in students' history books? How accurate are their portrayals? And also, do the students do they buy it? Do they buy the information given to them, or do they as well think that this is an exaggeration?
This is not really a question I can answer because I've not been through the education system in Iran. I have had some emails from people in Iran about the book and engaging with it. What I imagine they're taught is the regime's interpretation of this. The official title is Bazmi Ahriman. So this sort of idea that there was nothing really positive about it, that it was reflective of the Shah's megalomania and his, Eurocentrism. So I can't imagine there would be anything positive taught in schools about this subject. There may be people in the audience who are better at answering that question than me.
Great, thank you. The next question is from Mark Imperatori. Thanks very much. It was really very interesting. Was there a particular reason the journalists had such a negative attitude towards the celebrations? What kind of journalists were invited? For example, foreign correspondents.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. And actually the question of how journalists approach the celebrations is very interesting. I mean, I would, to a certain extent, disagree with the Dutch ambassador, because I think on the whole, having studied lots of these newspaper reports, on the whole, most of them were fairly positive, actually. Even there was one of the journalists invited was a guy called Walter Schwartz. He was the Guardian, the Manchester Guardian, as you'll know, which is quite a left-leaning publication. And his reports on the celebrations were even quite positive. So I don't think it's the case that all of the reports were negative. I think it's the case that the negative ones are those most vividly remembered, because they focused on the sort of decadence of the Pahlavi court and these things that were because at this time in the West, newspapers were writing about the negative aspects of the Pahlavi regime. They were writing about the lack of democracy, the corruption, and all of this. So the celebrations as this huge international event gave lots of opportunities to draw attention even more to this corruption and this lack of democracy and the sort of tyranny of the Shah.
Great, thank you. Our next question is also something that I wanted to ask, which is, How is Cyrus viewed today in the Islamic Republic was something that I was thinking about during your presentation. And in line with that, we have a question from Cyrus Kadivar. We recently celebrated the Queen's Platinum celebrations. As an Iranian present in Iran during the Persepolis, I could not help notice with some irony the similarities aimed at promoting national unity and reverence for the institution of the monarchy. Any refreshing observations and contrasting observations? And then there's a follow-up question with that.
I think the Cyrus the Great is an fascinating historical character in Iran, but I think it depends who you ask in Iran. Cyrus the Great has obviously become a lot more popular in recent years. And of course, everyone knows about this celebration that's now held every year in the end of October at the tomb of his in Pasargad. But the regime also latches onto this, because they're aware of how Cyrus is seen around the world, and even the regime latches onto this and recognizes this. For example, I was reading a newspaper article, and I reference it in my book actually, from when Ali Larijani, who was a Speaker of Parliament at the time, went to Croatia and informed the Croatian Speaker of Parliament that the name Croatia comes from the name of Cyrus the Great, and was he aware of this? So I think this is really useful history for Iranian diplomats to employ when speaking around the world. But I think Cyrus is becoming more popular now as the years have passed. And I think this is something that's only going to increase into the future. And there are even some politicians who have been calling in recent years for this sort of unofficial holiday, this unofficial celebration of Cyrus the Great to become an official holiday, that is actually marked as part of the calendar. And of course, we can see the Cyrus cylinder traveled to Iran in 1971. And this was quite low key, actually. The Richard Barnett, the head of West Asian Antiquities in the British Museum, he just traveled to Iran with it in his sports holdall, if you can believe that. And he sort of smuggled it out of Iran in the end. But when the cylinder traveled to Iran for the second time, while Ahmadinejad was president, it was a huge ceremony. It was a major event. So it just shows the power of Cyrus the Great and these sort of relics associated with him. And I think, yes, these types of royal events, as Cyrus Kadivar in his question noted, are actually very similar. But I think there is a huge difference in that, of course, in Britain, we have a monarchical system, and we have a different relationship to the Queen, as do Iranians with their history. And in the English coronation, in the English, the celebration we've had recently for the Queen's Platinum Jubilee, it was a very national, inclusive celebration for British people. So if you go around the streets, there's bunting everywhere. There are, there are events that people go to, street parties. But what the celebrations lacked was the participation in that way of the Iranian people. And I think this was one of the major problems that the regime invited in carrying out the way they did, because they invited the criticism that this was an event that was for foreigners and the Iranians weren't even invited. And of course, there were events held, but not on the scale as we had in Britain last week or over the weekend. So I think there are some similarities, but there are also huge differences.
In line with that, what did other world leaders at the time have to say about the celebration?
Well, those that attended were incredibly positive about it. I've read lots of diplomatic reports. They're all very, very positive. Lots of leaders from Africa, in particular, Leopold Sedar Senghor, for example, later would write letters to the Shah and speak about his attendance at the celebrations as being, leaving a huge mark on his in his memory. And in the British archives, they're generally quite positive. I think that those that were present were quite positive about it. Some of those who didn't attend, for example, President Pompidou, he was quite critical. But on the whole, even in private correspondence, I think it was received quite well by these heads of state.
Thank you. During your research, what most surprised you? Was there anything that just you did not see or expect to have found?
It's a really good question. I was quite frequently surprised, actually. It was, you maybe let me have a little think about it. I'm trying to think of one story that I can give you, but let me have a think and come back to me.
Great. While you think on that, I'm curious if you could touch more on, you definitely touched on this, but do you have more details on how Mohammad Reza Shah was linked to Cyrus? And I don't know if this was covered in your research or not, but did Iranians buy that? Like, did they buy that linking? And this doesn't, like, for those who were supportive of the monarchy to begin with, did they believe that there was this 2,500-year link and totally understood the connection that was trying to be made?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and again, I think we have to not think of the Iranian population as one block. There are people who have different views. There were obviously people who were very supportive of the monarchy. I can hardly believe that anyone would believe there was a real blood link linking the Shah and Cyrus the Great. But I think this was about the monarchy itself as an institution. And of course, the founder of the monarchy was Cyrus the Great. So by linking him in this respect, it really strengthened this narrative of a 2,500-year link. And we read, the revolution ended 2,500 years of monarchy in Iran, but actually the monarchy was much older than that in Iran. And there were periods when Iran wasn't ruled by an Iranian monarch. So this sort of line doesn't really exist. But we talk about that line in a way because of how it was presented in the 1970s and even earlier. But I think the strongest ways in which the Shah was presented as the successor to Cyrus were evident during the celebrations, and I've spoken about them. These articles that have the text of the White Revolution and the text of the Cyrus Cylinder alongside one another, as if the White Revolution, or trying to draw in similarities between the two in terms of their historical significance. And I think the Shah, by creating this idea that the cylinder was a bill of human rights rather than merely a piece of propaganda, which essentially is what it was. This whole narrative of this came from that period as well. And in that way, the Shah, through these human rights conferences and Princess Ashraf, being on the UN human rights, working in human rights at the UN, the regime was able to show that these are ideas that have always been inherent in Iranian kingship. And the Shah, by practicing these, the same type of kingship, he was somehow linked to Cyrus the Great as well. I think there were many ways in which this sort of link was made.
Great, thank you for that fascinating answer. Next, we received a comment from Mehrdad Khonsari, a former Iranian diplomat during the celebrations, and he has requested to talk. If he is still available, we can let you talk. Oh, yes, looks like he is here. Feel free to share any insights that you have.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Thank you.
Thank you. I was in fact in charge of the celebrations program in the United States as a member of the embassy, and I was sort of witness to much of the publicity, the adverse publicity especially, and the gross exaggerations regarding the costs of the celebrations and the kind of things like, that were, grossly reported. But of course, at that time, as Dr. Steele correctly pointed out, Iran did not have such a high profile position as it was to have once the oil price rises came, and of course, when the revolution came. But I think the matters about cost were hugely exaggerated, as Mr. Ansari, whom Dr. Steele referred to, and Shujaddin Shafa have made reference to. One point that is important to highlight, especially when you look back, and we can all look back, that really not so many heads of states or leaders from various governments. I mean, even as Dr. Steele pointed out, if Nixon was not able to come, his vice president was there. They were highly prominent people. There has never been a gathering of that nature, of that number, held any time ever since. Can imagine trying to hold something like that, even with half the personalities today. And some of the exaggerations regarding, for example, the cost of food, the food that was supplied in the tents when the guests were there. I mean, there were security aspects related to that, particular diets which heads of state have and insist upon. And when you have something like over 80 heads of states and leaders, the only way that you can give them the kind of assurances that you need is to contract as known establishment in the international arena where people feel safe. And these were the kind of considerations that were that have never received any kind of attention, though they are really part and parcel of everything. Anyway, I just thought that as Dr. Steele himself suggested, the actual celebrations, what went on in Shiraz or Persepolis, was just a small aspect of the whole thing, because of the number of Iranologists who were invited to participate in conferences, the number of books that were issued, the number of the amount of publicity that was generated by our embassies throughout the world to make Iran known. I mean, these were sort of relegated to obscurity in comparison to trying to say that, look at the ostentatious way in which this party was given and so on. I believe that as a point of acceptance of criticism, that we as part of the government did not handle what you call the publicity, the public relations side of this in a sophisticated manner, and we of course pay the price for that. But truth be told, I think that it was an event that put Iran on the map. It was not as expensive as everybody said, and the cost that I think Dr. Bill has referred to in his book, if you add the development projects and things like that is much closer to reality than any kind of other assertions. Thank you for giving me the time.
Thank you so much for that, Dr. Khonsari. Very, very lucky to have heard from someone who was there during the time. That's fascinating. Dr. Steele, if you have any comments to that, please go ahead. If not, I can ask you the next question.
Yeah, no, I agree completely. I mean, Dr. Shah writes about the American contribution in one of his interviews, and he writes that the American contribution was by far bigger than any other country. He writes about the exhibitions that were held in so many museums around the country. Was it the state of Utah declared an official Iran Day holiday? Yeah, there was the mayor of Los Angeles. Sorry, the mayor of Tehran received a key to the city of Los Angeles. There was yeah. It's fascinating to look at the events that took place around the world. I mean, I do talk about that quite extensively in my book, and I think it's really very interesting.
Thank you. Our next question is from Gareth Smith. What role did foreigners' hopes to get into the Iranian market, including the arms market, wasn't the Shah one of the world's biggest weapons buyers, play in their perceptions?
Yeah, this I guess this, I mean, naturally you've got sort of 62 representatives around the world coming to Iran. They're not just there because they're mates with the Shah, you know, they do want to get something in return. So obviously, you know, achieving positions within the Iranian market was a part of the reason why certain people attended. I don't think the arms market was really on the Shah's mind at this time. But quite interesting that the French, you know, President Pompidou didn't turn up, and he pulled out quite last minute, and that left the Shah quite angry. And the British ambassador writes that as a result of this, the French were in the doghouse, and actually a lot of deals with the French were cancelled, and it really had an effect on Iran-French relations. So there was, of course, you know, one had to, because the Shah was essentially in charge of foreign policy in Iran, if you wanted to achieve a good position for yourself, you had to really get on his good side. So I think this was a way in which some states did approach that. But I don't think the arms market was really, I mean, not that I've not read anything about the arms market being a big issue during these celebrations.
Thank you. Our next question is from Mariam Ala Amjadi. Thank you very much for this informative talk. Why were some countries excluded from the celebrations? Or what was the criterion for diplomatic invitations?
Well, I think, yeah, it's a really interesting question, actually. I think lots of countries, I mean, I think the majority of European countries were invited. The only countries that don't appear to have been invited in great numbers was African countries. And I think the reasons for this was that Iran had no real connection to many countries. So I think all of the countries with which Iran had some sort of relationship, they were all invited. For example, I spoke about Senghor and the Senegalese. Iran had actually established relations with Senegal just in April 1971. And it was during a meeting with Senghor that Ardeshir Zahedi had, who was foreign minister at the time. During his first meeting with Senghor, he invited him to attend the celebrations. So I think the criteria was really any country with which Iran had diplomatic relations. And it was as simple as that, really.
Great, thank you. Our next question is from Firuze Kashani Sabet. Robert, thank you very much for this fascinating and rich presentation. What was the reception of your book among historians of Iran and the diaspora? Was it difficult to present this research because of contemporary politics?
It's a really good question. I mean, most of the reception I've had so far has been, quite positive. But when I've presented elsewhere on other subjects related to the celebrations, not necessarily in my book, there is some criticism, and it's not because, I mean, sometimes I'm challenging a narrative that's well established. So sometimes when you do that, people can be dismissive, and you're sort of, I don't know, the Pahlavi history is quite difficult because it's still quite recent. The revolution was just over 40 years ago. A lot of people are still alive who had experiences with the Pahlavi regime, and they have these very strong and vivid impressions. So as soon as you sometimes start to say something positive, or you can be labeled a monarchist, and it's not happened to me as much, but it's happened to other people who I know who also work on the Pahlavi period. But I do think things are starting to change, and it's because now there are more people working on the Pahlavi period now than there have been in recent years. So I think things are beginning to change. But I've not, to answer Firuza's question, I've not found it difficult to present my research because of contemporary politics. But I can see how some people might have that. I mean, I'm in a good position because I'm not Iranian. So in this sense, no one can claim that I have any political affiliation. Whereas I can imagine that some people do.
Thank you for that. Our next question, and we have just two more questions. Identity crisis or confusion exists in today's Iran. On one hand, the current rulers are trying to portray an Islamic Iranian identity where the royal celebration was part of old Persia and more nationalist identity. How do you see these competing ideologies evolving in the future of Iran on the global stage?
Well, I think actually the current rulers do try to portray Islamic Iranian identity, but actually they still do draw on old Persia as they say. For example, I mean, I was in Senegal a couple of weeks ago, driving past the Iranian embassy, and there was a big poster celebrating 50 years of Iran-Senegalese relations. And the next poster was a big sort of picture of Persepolis. There's sort of now a rite of passage where every president of Iran has to go to Persepolis. They've all been pictured walking around Persepolis. So I think the regime today, they will use this sort of ancient Persia to their advantage, to their political advantage. So they don't really base their legitimacy on this in the same way that the Pahlavis do. So there is a clear difference, but they still recognize the importance of this narrative, and they still employ it when it suits them.
Very interesting, thank you. And now the last question from Heinrich Matti. What role did Persian poets, poetry, sung poems, or representations thereof play during this event? And did those references, if any, mostly refer to the classical poets?
I mean, there was a whole host of cultural activity associated with these events. Some received more attention than others. I know you read the newspapers at the time, and they're quite frequently poems written specially. There were poetry competitions. to write an ode about Cyrus the Great or an ode about the Shah or these types of things. In terms of classical poetry performances, there were certainly these types of events, but they would have been on the fringes of the official program rather than a central part of them. And also internationally, I mean, in North Africa, there were programs of Iranian dance and theatrical music in Rabat, for example. So I think globally, this sort of stuff would have been more important than in Iran itself.
Thank you. So that was the last question, but we have a comment I'd like to read from Dr. Ervand Abrahamian. He said the French president declined the invitation because he was suffering from cancer. Since this information was confidential, the Shah was not informed of the real reason for his not coming. In one of the confidential reports sent by the British ambassador in 1971, he wrote to the effect that, quote, despite all the pomp and ceremony, end quote, the celebrations were really designed to cover up the fragility of the regime. If you have any comments on that, otherwise we can wrap things up. Just very interesting to note for the audience there.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I didn't know about President Pompidou and cancer, although he did say, there's this quote attributed to him where he said he didn't want to be considered just another French waiter, because, and I think the Shah probably heard that. I mean, President Heinemann of Germany, he didn't attend because he had an eye infection, which was apparently very real. But yeah, no, I didn't know about President Pompidou and cancer.
Very interesting. Thanks for that, Dr. Abrahamian. And I think that ends today's event. Thank you so much, Dr. Steele, for your time and for your incredibly interesting presentation. Please, to anyone who enjoyed the event, do go out and get his book. It is called The Shah's Imperial Celebrations of 1971, Nationalism, Culture, and Politics in Late Pahlavi Iran. It's published with Bloomsbury Publishing. And our next Spotlighting an Author event is August 12th with Mona Tajali. We'll be discussing women's political representation in Iran and Turkey. And if you found today's event interesting and you'd like to find out more about the project, you can check us out at Iran1400.org. We have content in both English and Farsi through articles, videos, podcasts, events, and more. And we discuss ideas and institutions such as modernity, identity, education, fine arts, and the women's movement. If you scroll to the bottom of our website, you can sign up to receive our newsletters, and they'll alert you of new content and upcoming events like the one that we just had today. And lastly, you can follow us on social media at Iran 1400 Project. Thank you again, Dr. Steele, for your time. We're very grateful.
Thank you for having me.